As a decade, the 90s were filled with a neon attitude that challenged authority, drenched itself in the occasional dose of nihilism, and pushed boundaries. Sega found its success in this atmosphere by challenging authority, in this case Nintendo, with attitude and brashness. They were in your face, bright, and deeply creative, particularly when compared to the well-known but boring established video game leader. It was in this atmosphere that ToeJam and Earl thrived. This 1991 game, produced by Johnson Vorsanger Productions for Sega, really captured more about the spirit of the decade than I think many of us realized at that point. It was genuinely unique, infused with modern culture, but in a lot of ways was also a callback to a classic genre that many of us have never played. The game featured two unlikely alien heroes, a three-legged red thing and his tall, stout friend, searching for a way home on an unfamiliar planet, Earth. The game's unique nature, twisted humor, and constantly shifting landscape earned it praise from critics, decent sales, and a legacy that endured more than 3 decades later. In today's video, we're going to discuss ToeJam and Earl. The development of this game starts in college. It was the brainchild of Greg Johnson. Johnson, born in 1960, began studying programming in college. It was during this time period that Johnson first played Rogue, a game which we have discussed on an earlier video on games so good that they literally invented new genres. Rogue is responsible for creating the roguelike genre. Roguelikes are dungeon crawlers where players move through procedurally generated levels. As such, no two gameplays are ever the same. At its core, that's what ToeJam and Earl is. Johnson worked on Starflight for EA Games, but had his own ideas. While in Hawaii, Johnson first developed the idea for the character and plot of ToeJam and Earl. Returning to work, Johnson met Mark Vorsanger, and the two hit it off. Vorsanger liked the idea of ToeJam and Earl, and the two formed their own production company, Johnson Vorsanger Productions, to make the game. Enter Sega. The two men were able to secure a meeting with Sega of America, and the game caught the attention of Hugh Bowen, marketing manager for Sega. Bowen immediately realized what he had on his hands: a deeply unique game that fit Sega's gaming philosophy and one that could help create title characters that could combat Nintendo's video game dominance. With Sega's backing and an official company, development of the game began in earnest. A team of about 6 developers programmed the game, designed its art, and ensured smooth gameplay. Music was composed by John Baker, who would work for a variety of other games, including Gex and Warriors of Might and Magic. Baker would later be brought back for the 2019 ToeJam and Earl. The plot of the game is kind of hilarious. Our two alien friends, ToeJam and Earl, crash land on Earth. In doing so, their ship, the Righteous Ratmaster rocket ship, scatters across the game. Your job is to navigate through the game's various levels and collect all 10 ship pieces. Once you do that, the game's over and you fly home. Now, obviously, it's not that easy. You start on a beginner level where you first familiarize yourself with the core game mechanics. You can walk, swim, and collect presents. By the way, if you happen to get a present that lets you cover huge swaths of distance in record time, like the rocket skates, you can access a bonus stage in the bottom left corner. Totally worth it. Enter the elevator, and the procedural generation kicks in, as the first stage is the only stage where the layout is the same on every playthrough. You proceed through the levels, all with different layouts. If a level has a ship piece on it, you get a big note saying, "Ship piece here!" Otherwise, you can run straight to the elevator. And that's the thing. You have to find the elevator, which is not always easy. You have to walk across a level of varying sizes and navigate an extensive range of enemies, which only get harder over time. These bad guys include crazy ladies with shopping carts, devils, hamsters, nerds, and more. There's also an added complication, and something that was very unique to the game. The bad guys can knock your power meter down, yes, and if you run out of lives, the game is over. What's almost worse is that the bad guys can knock you over the edge of a level, forcing you to go back down a stage. From there, you have to navigate to the elevator, and then wait out the elevator scene while it loads, which could be really boring. Personally, I used to hate when you would get knocked down, and then get knocked down again, and 15 minutes of progress was gone. Even worse was when you fell down a level, but wound up on a part of the next level that was inaccessible. Don't have a power-up to make it across? You gotta drop back down to get back up. The game does have cash as an in-game currency, and you can use that cash to make certain purchases, including buying present, revealing sections of the map, and identifying what the presents were. Among the vendors you buy from is a carrot. Fine. The aforementioned presents could serve as power-ups. They could be collected, stored, and used at a moment of your choosing. Presents came in literal different shapes, sizes, and colors, but the same present was always the same for each item for every playthrough. Thus, once you unwrapped one, it was revealed in your storage for the rest of the run. The presents could be awesome. There were tomatoes that could kill enemies, cash, food, added speed, extra lives, and more. But not all presents were good. Some were actually negative. For example, there was the total bummer, which literally killed you. The game did have a point system, which was impacted by opening presents, navigating terrain, and collecting chip pieces. These points would translate to higher ranks, which ranged from Wiener to Funklord. And the higher the rank, the larger your health bar. Incidentally, this leveling system, rudimentary though it was, helped incentivize players to explore and collect items. This added yet another element of the roguelike genre to the game. A lot of things really distinguished ToeJam and Earl from the competition. First, as I've been saying this whole video, it was an accessible roguelike. While other games on home consoles used some form of procedural generation, ToeJam and Earl was one of the first games, if not the first game, that actually relied exclusively on procedural generation to create its worlds. If I'm wrong on that, by the way, please let me know in the comments. Could easily be wrong. Often am. Of course, the real joy of the game came from playing it with two players. The two characters would greet each other if they wandered away and reunited. They had random dialogue in elevators. But, importantly, the two-player system actually had real advantages. For example, if one player was low on lives, the better player, or the big brother, let's be honest, could give the worst player lives. None of these options were available on the single-player game, and it was pretty clear which version the developers preferred. Johnson and Vorsanger once said that the game was a, quote, two-player game with one-player options, which was a marked switch from most games at the time. You cannot discuss ToeJam and Earl without discussing the influence of urban culture and the 90s on the game. I mean, look at these guys. ToeJam looks like a 90s stereotype, complete with his gold medallion and always sideways cap. Earl looks like the neighbor you saw outside of your house, with his high tops and sunglasses so thick that you can never see his eyes. The two talk with real banter and attitude, with ToeJam often telling Earl to stop doing something or yelling at him for farting. The dialogue and the ranks are replete with idioms, including dude and bro, that first became popular in the 90s. They even have an opening rap that is reminiscent of some of the strangest parts of early 90s music. Speaking of music, the jazz and funk influence of the soundtrack is very, very apparent, and equally as distinctive. Honestly, the entire time I was writing the script, and even now, as I'm recording it, all I can hear is the music. I may need to talk to a therapist. The game is funny. It's an over-the-top version of Earth and our lives, a looking-glass perspective of what we may seem like to an alien culture. Despite the fact that ToeJam and Earl look a little different, you feel for them. They seem normal, and not normal like must save the princess and never ever talk silent hero sort of way. They sounded and acted like their target audience, like us. The game's success showed in the final sales numbers. It started slow, but it's worth keeping in mind that ToeJam and Earl came out in 1991, around the same time that Alex Kidd was being bumped out of the way by Sonic. Sonic began to take off, and once it did, his popularity boosted system-wide sales. This, in turn, boosted the sales of other games, like ToeJam and Earl. In the end, the game received near universal praise for its humor, music, graphics, and playstyle. It moved 350,000 units, and while that wasn't enough to crack the top 20 in terms of Sega games sold, it did ensure that the game had more than enough momentum to produce a sequel on the system. That sequel took a windy path. First, there was Ready Aim Tomatoes. This appeared as a minigame with the Menacer peripheral, sort of Sega's answer to the Zapper gun of Nintendo. In the game, you use the gun to fire tomatoes. It's pretty self-explanatory. Johnson and Vorsanger got to work on a full-fledged sequel after that. The new game would have featured ToeJam and Earl returning to Earth for a rap concert, only to have their CDs stolen. There would be no procedural generation, and instead, the levels would feature far more detailed terrains that were both indoors and outdoors. Sega didn't appear to be as enthusiastic about this game as they were the first one, so Johnson and Vorsanger switched gears, instead changing genres to a platformer. The end game was ToeJam and Earl, Panic on Funkotron, released in 1993. In this one, our two alien friends had to capture the Earthlings who had hitched a ride on their ship when they returned to their home planet. Critical reception was mixed, but many fans were disappointed that the game so abruptly switched genres. From there, development issues became a real challenge. In interviews, Johnson and Vorsanger said that Sega had the rights to the franchise, and they didn't plan on releasing a new game. That changed in 1995 when Johnson and Vorsanger regained the rights and went to work on developing a sequel for a new platform. They had a development deal with GT Interactive to create a new game that returned to the series' roots, only to have that deal fall apart in 1999. Moving on, the pair returned to Sega and announced a new game, ToeJam Earl and Letitia, which would introduce Letitia to the franchise. All characters were voiced. Actually, Letitia was almost voiced by Lisa Left Eye Lopez from TLC, which, not gonna lie, would have been pretty awesome. The game would be designed in 3D for the Dreamcast. Of course, if you've watched other videos on the subject, cough cough, see the description for more info, you know that the late 90s were not kind to Sega, and the Dreamcast was on its way out. Sega fell apart, and by 2002, ToeJam and Earl needed a new home. They found one on Xbox, where Johnson and Vorsanger were able to take the game and finally complete it. In 2002's ToeJam and Earl 3 Mission to Earth, you can play as ToeJam, Earl, or the new character, Letitia. Your goal is to return to Earth, where you must collect the 12 sacred albums of funk and defeat Anti-Funk, marking the first time that the series had a main villain. Fun fact, Anti-Funk was originally supposed to have a head that looked like a KKK mask, which would have been an intentional statement against racism. Sega shot this down, unfortunately. The game merged a few genres, resulting in a combination platformer and action-adventure game. Levels are, again, procedurally generated, but connected by hubs, and the game still requires you to collect power-ups and defeat weird bad guys. It seems worth noting here that Johnson and Vorsanger didn't want to make the new game like this. Instead, they basically wanted to remake the original ToeJam and Earl, but developers rejected that notion. That probably explains why so many of the elements of this game are so similar to the original. However, the game didn't do well. Reviews were mixed. Once again, the humor hit, but critics expressed concern about the repetitive gameplay, unfair enemies, and more conventional style. And that was it for ToeJam and Earl. Until 2015. With the rise in popularity of games that didn't need publishers, Greg Johnson decided he wanted to take another run at releasing a ToeJam and Earl game. By now, Johnson had formed his own company, Human Nature Studios. Johnson decided to forego finding a publisher in favor of a Kickstarter campaign, and given the repeated issues that he had with developers and publishers, I don't blame him one bit. In March 2015, Johnson announced a Kickstarter campaign for the development of a new game, with the goal being $400,000. Johnson hit $500,000 for the game, enabling him to hire an engineer and an artist and set a timetable of August 2016. Johnson was in luck, as Adult Swim Games signed on to the project and delivered additional funding, meaning that the game would make it onto additional platforms. Unfortunately, that deal would fall apart and delay development. Seems like this keeps happening to poor Johnson. Fortunately, though, it didn't stop the ultimate publication of the game. Finally, in 2019, ToeJam and Earl, Back in the Groove, made it to all major gaming consoles. The game is more or less a remake of the original. There are more characters, minigames, presents, and enemies, but fans of the 1991 game will feel right at home. The game was praised for its faithfulness to the original and once again deemed as hilarious. It performed well from a sales perspective. According to a Nintendo Life article, it sold 53,500 copies in its first 20 days, with nearly half of those sales occurring on the Switch. Later, LinkedIn posts from Matthew Kahn, who worked on the game, said that it sold more than 200,000 copies in total. Perhaps the game still isn't done. Believe it or not, in December 2022, it was announced that a ToeJam and Earl movie was in development, with Johnson and Vorsanger attached as executive producers. The script was being written by Amos Vernon and Nunzio Randazzo, both of whom are experienced scriptwriters who have written for movies like Hotel Transylvania 4. The plot will apparently hew closely to the game. ToeJam and Earl journey to Earth in search of the planet's legendary music, only to discover that the planet is not at all what it seems. As such, they must find as much of Earth's music as possible to save both their home planet and our world. Even more hilarious, the studio that is bringing the movie to life includes Story Kitchen and Unanimous Media, which is owned by basketball star Steph Curry. Amazon Studios is signed on as the distributor. No word as of yet when shooting will begin or when the movie will launch, but I will tell you that including Steph Curry and ToeJam and Earl in the same sentence is really something I didn't have on my bingo card. I really have to admit, I find this all funny. In an era where so many major games are static and repetitive, we definitely don't need another first-person shooter. The fact that this franchise has been able to stay alive for more than 30 years truly speaks to its unique nature. It's also a credit to Sega. They went with something unique, and all of us have reaped the rewards. And I mean multiple generations of all of us. When I was a kid, I still remember going to my best friend's house. I had the Super Nintendo, and he had the Sega. We played ToeJam and Earl incessantly, and at the time, I just thought it was the coolest game in the world. It was so different than anything else I had ever played. Fast forward about 30 years, and my then 10-year-old son and I are playing the game together. A year after that, it's my son and his little sister screaming at each other about what presents to get and who really needs that power-up. That's pretty cool. Dare I say funky? And that's all for this video. As always, you made it to the end, so please hit that subscribe and like button so you could see more of the videos that we produce. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed, and have a wonderful day out there.